Magandang gabi bayan. Welcome to the deep dive. Um, you know how sometimes you see these big corporations, right? And they got their eyes set on a piece of land, maybe it's for a new project or something, and they make an offer to buy, but the owner's just like, nope, not selling.
Happens all the time, especially with infrastructure projects.
Right. But then things get kind of crazy because the corporation decides, well, if they won't sell willingly, we'll just force them to. We're talking eminent domain.
Ah, yeah, eminent domain. It's a powerful tool, that's for sure.
It kind of feels like something out of a teleserie, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what went down. In this case, we're diving into today. Iloilo Grain versus NGCP.
This case is fascinating because it really digs into the whole clash between private property rights and, well, the needs of those big infrastructure projects we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tug of war. So let's set the scene. We've got Iloilo Grain Complex Corporation, IGCC. They own this piece of land in Iloilo City.
Prime real estate, I bet.
And then along comes the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines, NGCP, the folks who keep the lights on, literally. They need a chunk of IGCC's land for, let me see here, a cable terminal and transmission line. Sounds pretty standard, right?
Pretty much par for the course when you're talking about managing the national power grid.
Except IGCC throws a curveball and says, no way, Jose.
Really? They just flat out refused.
Yep, they weren't happy with the price NGCP was offering.
Sure.
And that's when NGCP decides to play their trump card, that eminent domain thing we were talking about.
So basically saying, look, we need this land and we're taking it.
Power move, right. But the thing is, even though they've got this power, our Salagang Batas, the Constitution, is pretty clear that private property can't just be snatched up without just compensation, and it's got to be for public use.
It's all about finding that balance, right? The needs of the many versus the rights of the individual.
Exactly. So IGCC decides to fight back. They're not just arguing about the money. They're questioning if NGCP even needs to take their land in the first place.
Oh, so they're saying there might be other options.
That's their argument. They're pointing to a couple of possibilities, a straight line option for the project versus a curved line one. And they're asking, why does it have to cut through our property?
Makes you wonder if NGCP really did their due diligence, explored all the possibilities before zeroing in on IGCC's land.
Right. I mean, if someone wanted to build something that went right through your backyard, you'd want to know they'd considered every other option, right?
Absolutely. No one wants to feel like they're being bulldozed,
Right.
literally or figuratively.
And IGCC didn't stop there. They also raised the question of whether NGCP had actually negotiated fairly. Like, did they really try to work things out?
Because just compensation isn't just about the amount, right? It's also about the process.
Exactly. It's got to be above board, transparent, all that good stuff.
Otherwise, it just feels like they're using their clout to get what they want, no matter the cost.
And then, just when you thought it couldn't get any juicier, IGCC throws in this legal bombshell. They ask, did NGCP even get the okay from the Energy Regulatory Commission, the ERC, before diving into this whole project?
Oh, now that's interesting, because I know the law is pretty clear that the ERC has to give the green light for projects like this.
Exactly. So now we've got this whole legal showdown brewing. It's like David versus Goliath, Philippine edition. We're talking about the case officially known as GR Known 265153.
And when was this decided?
April 12, 2023. Pretty recent, right? And the lower courts, well, they sided with NGCP, even granted them a writ of possession.
Hold on, a writ of possession. Doesn't that mean NGCP could basically start taking over the land before the case is even settled?
That's the gist of it, yeah. Philippine legal procedure can be kind of wild sometimes. There's this whole rule, and the court figured NGCP had met the basic requirements, so bam, writ of possession.
So IGCC could potentially be forced off their land without even a full hearing on whether the taking was legit?
It definitely highlights how the scales can be tipped in these kinds of situations. But hold on to your hats, folks, because IGCC wasn't done yet. They took this whole thing to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so lower court says, go NGCP. What did the highest court in the land have to say about all this?
So the Supreme Court, they had a lot to unpack here, right? They basically hit the pause button on that lower court ruling.
Oh.
It's like they were saying to NGCP, hey, you can't just assume you've got free reign just because you've got that eminent domain card up your sleeve.
Kind of like saying, yeah, we know you need to keep the power grid humming, but let's make sure everyone's playing fair.
Right. The court really drove home the point that NGCP couldn't just brush aside property owners' rights, even with that eminent domain power. They had to show they genuinely looked at all the other options before resorting to, well, basically taking the land.
And that brings us back to those other routes for the project, right? Like that curved line option. I mean, I got to ask, why were they so set on going through IGCC's property? It makes you wonder if there wasn't more to it than met the eye. And that's exactly what the lower court has to dig into now, thanks to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was pretty clear. Show us your work in GCP. Prove that taking this specific land is a must, not just the easy or cheap way out.
Like, imagine your neighbor decides to build a pool, but the easiest way is to just cut right through your garden. You want to be sure they'd at least thought about other possibilities first, right?
Sure. No one wants to feel like their property is just a means to an end, you know? And that's the whole principle the Supreme Court is upholding here. Property rights matter. You can't just trample on them without a darn good reason. It's all about striking that balance between what the community needs and protecting individual rights.
It's not just about those alternative routes, though, right? Didn't we say there was also the whole good faith negotiation thing?
Yeah.
I think the Supreme Court was pretty adamant that NGCP had to show they'd really tried to work things out with IGCC before pulling the eminent domain lever.
You're absolutely right. Remember, it's not just about the money, it's about how you go about things. NGCP had to prove they'd sat down with IGCC, listened to their concerns, and truly tried to reach an agreement.
The question is, did they actually do that? Or was it all for show?
That's for the lower court to decide. It's like the Supreme Court handed them a magnifying glass and said, okay, go back and take a good hard look, make sure everything was on the up and up.
It's turning into a legal thriller.
And don't forget, they also have to revisit that whole issue of the missing ERC approval.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's a big one.
Because remember, that approval's not just a rubber stamp. It's there to make sure projects like this fit into the bigger picture, the country's energy plan. It's got to be for the public good.
So NGCP can't just decide they want a new transmission line and build it wherever they please. They've got to have the ERC on board.
It's kind of like getting a building permit, right? You need to make sure everything's up to code, follows the rules. That's what the ERC does for energy projects.
This whole case really underscores how important those checks and balances are, even when we're talking about something as crucial as infrastructure. There's got to be a system to make sure it's all being done right, fairly.
Right. And the courts, well, they play a vital role in making sure those checks and balances are working the way they should. And the Supreme Court's decision, it's a message that no one is above the law, not even the guys responsible for keeping our lights on.
I like that. Not even the folks keeping the lights on.
And I think that's a message that resonates with Filipinos. It's about fairness, about having a system where everyone's rights are protected, especially when you're up against big players.
What I find so interesting about this case is that it goes beyond just the legal back and forth. It touches on some really big themes. Fairness, transparency, accountability. Makes you think about power dynamics, how to make sure the little guy doesn't get trampled.
It's about those core values that underpin a democracy. Having a voice, making sure everyone's rights are respected, that power is used responsibly, it's a big deal.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I mean, we've gone from property rights to eminent domain, all the way to procedural rules, the whole genuine necessity concept, the ERC, and of course, the Supreme Court stepping in to, well, keep things honest.
And it shows just how complex our legal system is, how it tries to juggle all those competing interests and still make sure things are fair.
But wait, there's more. The story's not over yet. That big question still hangs in the air.
Yeah.
What's the lower court going to decide now that the case is back in their hands?
Right, because no matter what happens next, this case has set a precedent. It's a clear sign that even the big guys have to play by the rules, that property rights have teeth, and the courts are there to back them up.
It's kind of inspiring, right? Like this smaller company stood up to a giant and said, hey, we have rights too. And the courts listened. They said, you know what, you're right. Let's make sure everything's above board.
It's a reminder that we all have a voice. And the legal system, well, it can be a powerful tool for making sure that things are done right.
So before we wrap up, we want to hear from you, our listeners. We're really curious. What are your thoughts on this whole David versus Goliath situation? Have you ever been in a similar spot? Maybe a big company tried to use eminent domain or, even just the threat of it to get their hands on your property. We want to hear your stories, folks. Hit us up in the comments. And hey, while you're at it, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives just like this one.
And if you're sitting there thinking, whoa, all this legal talk is making my head spin, don't sweat it. We've got you covered. In the show notes, we've put together a little cheat sheet breaking down all those key legal concepts in plain English. Trust me, Understanding this stuff can really come in handy if you ever find yourself in a similar situation.
Knowledge is power, right? So let's just do a quick rundown of those key legal doctrines, just to refresh everyone's memory. First up, the big one, eminent domain. We've been throwing that term around a lot today.
It's basically the government's right to take private property for public use, even if the owner's not keen on selling. It's right there in our Constitution. But, and this is important, it's not a free-for-all.
That's where genuine necessity comes in. It's not enough for the government or some big corporation to just say, we need this land, period. They've got to prove it, show that there's a real solid reason why they need that specific piece of property.
Think of it this way. If your doctor told you needed surgery, you wouldn't just go under the knife without asking some questions, right? You'd want to know why it was necessary, if there were any other options. Well, genuine necessity in eminent domain cases is kind of like that. It makes sure property rights aren't just tossed aside.
Makes sense. And it doesn't stop there. There's also just compensation, right? That's a biggie.
Oh, absolutely. The Constitution is crystal clear. Property owners have to be paid fairly for their land. But again, it's not just about the dollar amount. It's got to be a fair process, too. Enter good faith negotiation.
All right, so before things end up in court, the government or the corporation, they've got to make a real effort to hammer out a deal with the property owner. It's about respect, being upfront, and trying to find a solution that works for everyone involved.
Just like any negotiation, really. You come to the table ready to listen, maybe compromise a bit, with the goal of finding that win-win situation.
Then there's the least burdensome principle. I think
Yeah.
this one's super important because it acknowledges that even when eminent domain is, like, unavoidable, there are ways to do it that cause the least amount of harm or disruption to the owner.
It's about minimizing the impact, basically. Even if they're working towards a bigger goal, they still got to consider the individual, find the most sensitive way to go about things.
It's kind of like saying, we get it. This is your home, your business, your land. It means something to you.
It's not just about the market value. There's sentimental value, history, a sense of belonging. You can't always put a price tag on that.
And last but not least, we've got due process, that bedrock principle that guarantees everyone a fair hearing. You get to tell your side of the story, challenge the government's actions in court, all that good stuff.
Transparency, accountability, making sure the rules are followed to the letter, that's what due process is all about. It's there to protect the little guy from getting steamrolled by the system.
It's good to know there are these legal safeguards in place, right? It's like a safety net, knowing that even if a big corporation comes knocking, you've got rights and you can fight for them.
Absolutely. And the Iloilo Grain versus NGCP case, it's the perfect example of how these principles work in real life. Even big corporations have to toe the line. Property rights are protected, and the courts are there to make sure justice is served.
It's a story that reminds us we're not powerless. We have a voice. And the legal system. It can be a powerful ally when you need it. So if you ever find yourself in a similar predicament, remember this case. Remember those legal doctrines we talked about. And most importantly, remember this. You have rights, and you've got the right to fight for them.
Speak up, get yourself a good lawyer, and stand your ground. Don't be afraid to.
Well said. And on that note, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into this fascinating case, Iloilo Grain versus NGCP. We hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we did. Don't forget to check out the show notes for more info on those legal terms, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive. We've got a ton of exciting topics coming up. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.